Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first part of programming. Like, how do you actually take training, a training day, and fit it into a week? And how do you fit that week into a month? How do you fit that month into an entire training season or a year? That's what periodization actually does. It programs, it plans. And today we're going to talk about, well, why would you do that? What's the physiological basis for periodization? And what are some strategies that we can use? So periodization has its roots in Hans Selye's model. Hans Selye was an endocrinologist who essentially found that humans and other animals have what he called a general adaptation syndrome, regardless of the stressor. So think about it. If you have an exam or a pop quiz, what's going to happen? You're going to have what he called the alarm reaction phase. And that's where you get a huge shot of adrenaline, and then after the exam, you might be worn down. But then you adapt, and if you have these frequent exams throughout the semester, you're like, okay, I could take them on. But then what happens near finals week or midterms week when you have tons of exams? Oftentimes you get sick. And he called this a stage of exhaustion. And if you never stopped having all these finals and you never got to sleep, eventually, that sickness would become just overwhelming. And so we can apply this same principle to training, right? So if you're resistance training, you go in the weight room and you're going to squat at 85% of your max for 5 sets. At first you might hit 315 for, let's say, 8 reps. But by the time you get to the 5th set, you might only be able to get it 3. Okay, and during that time, you're pumped up, you got music on, so you have adrenaline up, cortisol's up, and you have this overload stimulus. So the alarm reaction phase is right here. We have an overload. And if you look at your initial performance before it's at baseline, after the overload, your performance is down. You go from 8 to 3 reps. You have essentially a fight or flight response like epinephrine, norepinephrine. Okay, all the catecholamine responses and arousal is up. After that, you're sore, you're beat up, but your body gets its resources together and goes through what we call the stage of resistance. In the stage of resistance, your body fights to resist the stimulus, and we get an increase, and specific to what the training program was. So if you did a hypertrophy workout, you would resist by adding skeletal muscle mass. If it was primarily heavy, like singles and doubles, the primary adaptation might be neural. Now, ideally, we're fluctuating continually between alarm reaction and stage of resistance, back and forth, back and forth. We all know it doesn't happen like that. Eventually, what happens? We hit a dreaded plateau. And the question is, why do we plateau? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, if you have a very high training stimulus and you don't renege or take that training stimulus off, your body's going to essentially run out of resources. And you'll know that happens when you don't just plateau, when your performance starts to drop, which we call overreaching. Now, if your performance continues to plummet, we would call that overtraining, right? So another reason, though, you might plateau is because of a lack of variation. So if you don't vary the training stimulus, your body no longer goes through the alarm reaction phase, and therefore you will no longer go through stage of resistance because you have nothing your body needs to resist against. You're at homeostasis. And so you just remain at a plateau. This is called the biological law of accommodation, which means that a biological object or a human, their response to a given stimulus, if that stimulus remains unaltered, will decrease. Okay? So if you do 3 sets of 10 every workout, you're going to decrease. Okay? Now, if we program in rest, then eventually you will recover if, so in other words, if you're under recovered, you can plateau. We program rest. We'll continue to make gains as long as the variation is there. And we'll continue to move and strive closer to our genetic potential, which is here. The second model that's based on it was developed by Bannister. And Bannister proposed what's called the fitness fatigue model, or what Zaszorski calls the two-factor model. Essentially here we have a training stimulus, and a training stimulus leads to an increase in fitness, but also leads to an increase in fatigue. Okay, so think about it. When you're done training, you may make neural adaptations, but you might have muscle damage. In fact, I've done studies where we've seen individuals have huge gains from week 0 to 8 of training. Their 1RM goes up, but they actually have a lot of baseline muscle damage at week 8. But the adaptations they made in muscle size and neural outweigh the fatigue. So all athletes always have a measure of fatigue, but if fitness exceeds fatigue, performance is elevated. And again, we're accumulating both. You may program in rest to eliminate things like fatigue. This is, again, another model basically just showing what I just said. You work out, fitness increases, and fatigue also increases. Initially, fatigue is greater than fitness, and so preparedness is down, meaning your ability to perform. But fatigue is a lot more short-lived than fitness, even though it's more drastic, the changes. So after a workout, your 1RM might go down by 20%. However, that's going to recover in 24 to 48, maybe 72 hours, and fitness gains may allow you to increase your 1RM by 2%. So the fitness is longer lasting than the fatigue, but it's less drastic than the fatigue. This is our standard supercompensation model, which is essentially a breakdown build-up model. Initially, we train, and we have a so-called catabolic phase in which our performance is down, but then that segues to an anabolic phase in which we supercompensate. Ideally, you want to train, right where it goes ideal training, right when you supercompensate. Okay? And that might occur within 24 to 48 hours for a trained individual, but you don't want to wait too long. Otherwise, your performance will then decline. So again, this model suggests that we should train frequent enough to get supercompensation, but probably not too frequent so that we're training when we're still in the catabolic phase, but not too long so that we've exceeded the supercompensation phase and gone back down to baseline. So within that model, training frequency is very important. If you look at this graph A, if you cover, say, 2 weeks' time and you were to train 3 times, you'd have 3 supercompensation phases. But technically, on graph B, if you train more frequently, then you could have greater performance improvements. So frequency is a very key tool to performance improvements. The problem is, if you go back to Hans Selye's model, if you train too frequently, you never really get to that supercompensation phase. So if you train too frequently and your intensity is maximal every time you train, if you go to the bottom graph, you're going to have a decline in performance. However, if you alternate with training high maximal training stimuli with submaximal training stimuli, you will improve in sort of a wave-like fashion. Okay, so the point is frequency is high. You cannot institute frequency if you have maximal stimuli every single training session. So that has to be taken in mind. Again, rest has to be taken into mind, along with these bouts of alarm reaction phases. So clearly, variation is an important factor to consider in. You guys know you have your acute training variables where you can vary things. A few ways you can vary your exercise selection. When you change your exercise, you need to use similar bimotor abilities. So that means changes should occur before complete adaptation and stagnation occurs. So if you do a back squat, you can do a variation from a back squat low bar to a high bar squat, to a safety bar squat, to a closed stance squat, to a wide stance squat, to squats with chains, to squats with bands. Those are all variations of the squat that will improve the criterion task of squatting. But if you continually just do the same stance of squatting with no variation, you will hit a plateau. Okay? Which again, Hans Selye called the stage of exhaustion. Okay? Another thing we can do is we can alternate heavy and lighter loads, and we can change frequency and intensity. One day use 2 a day, the next day 1 a day, ultimately to facilitate recovery. So this is an example of a study that we did with that Adu, Dr. DeSouza headed up in our lab. So actually did this in Carlos Ugrinowicz's lab in Brazil. And what we ended up doing was we have a constant intensity, constant exercise condition. So you see CI, CE. And basically you just do a linear model. So 4 sets of 8 RM squats, 6 sets of 8 RM squats the next couple of weeks, the next 4 weeks, and the next 4 weeks, 9 sets of 8 RM squats. If you go to constant intensity varying exercise, you did squats 2x8, leg press 2x8. Then the next 4 weeks, swapped out the leg press for deadlift. The next 4 weeks, you added deadlifts and lunges. So you're varying the exercises while controlling for volume. Notice that the variable exercise group made greater increases in strength because they're not plateauing. Also interesting is that the constant group hypertrophied only in the VL and VI, the vas lateralis and vastus intermedialis, but the variable hypertrophied in all 4 heads of the quads. Let's talk about loading strategies. There's a couple different loads that you can expose your body to. One's stimulatory. It's above what you're used to. The next day you're sore. We have a retaining load where we go in and we just get in a training stimulus. It's not enough to increase adaptation. It's just maintenance. And then we have a detraining load, and that's when we start slacking off in the gym or whatever happens, or we get injured and we no longer can train as hard. So taking all this into consideration, there are a number of different types of programs that we see. The most thing that most people use is called standard loading. So they'll open up a magazine and read, oh, this is how I get, this is my workout that I get my arms big with, right? And it's one workout, say it's like 3 sets of 12 for standing curls, 3 sets of 12 for incline curls, 3 sets of 12 for preacher curls. Well, they'll say, oh, I can get my arms that huge too, so I'm just going to follow this program for 12 weeks. Well, initially during that preparatory phase, they may make gains. Maybe the first 3 weeks, but then they plateau and they get stagnation of performance gains. Okay, because they're following the same, essentially, train loads and densities. Right, so that's standard load, and that's what most people face, and that's why they quit. The next model is linear loading, and that's essentially where basically every single week you're increasing the load and the intensity every single workout. Now that's going to get you gains for the first couple weeks, But if you keep raising the load and intensity every single workout, eventually it's going to exceed your capacity. It will exceed your recovery capacity, and you'll actually hit that stage of exhaustion and likely overreach. Okay, so again, that's where you have to program in rest. You can't just linearly load. You have to consider the fact that eventually you're going to run out of resources and overreach. So what we want to talk about is you talk about a training block. And a training block could be, for example, like a month long where you're focusing on a specific attribute. Okay. Now, if you have someone who's novice or youth, what we do is we use what we call step loading. And step loading is sort of a hybrid. What you'll do is you'll do linear loading where you're increasing possibly the volume and the intensity, or one or the other. And once you hit a point, you then do a retaining load. Okay? So the workload microcycles, you have stimulatory, stimulatory, stimulatory. That stimulus keeps increasing from 1 week to the next. And then you go through a restitution microcycle where you do a retaining load. So for someone who's novice or youth, we might have 2 weeks of that, and then we go back to retaining. Someone who's more experienced, you might step load where you step up for 3 weeks, and then you unload in a restitution mesocycle. And then again, that unloading is more of a maintenance stimulus. If you carry that step loading for longer than 3 weeks, like 4 weeks, you may need a restitution of 2 weeks. So the more the fatigue is, the longer that sort of short-term taper will be. This is a good model by Plisk, actually, and Plisk suggested that step loading every block or 4 week cycle, you're going to slightly increase the intensity and the volume. So as you can see from cycle 1 to cycle 2 to cycle 3, you have slight minute increases in volume and intensity with every block. And again, after each restitution cycle, which is the green, you should be able to take on a little bit more load. As psychologically and physiologically, you should be recovered. Okay, so let's talk about the sort of a planned overreaching cycle. This is called concentrated loading. That again is where you're purposely going to push yourself past the point of being able to recover to where you kind of push yourself right into the beginning of that stage of exhaustion because of lack of recovery, and you follow that by a longer restitution cycle. So this is obviously going to occur only a few times a year, and when psychological stress is lowest. This is an example of a concentrated loading cycle that we did in our study. So this creatine kinase levels, which is a marker of muscle damage. We had people train for 8 weeks standard loading. So you see muscle damage is not terribly high at week 8. But then weeks 9 and 10, we really beat them up. Did a concentrated loading cycle. Notice that their creatine kinase levels skyrocketed. And then we followed that by a restitution cycle, which essentially we lowered their volume by 60%, and their creatine kinase recovered. So they didn't have as much damage, weeks 11 and 12. And if you look, these were very advanced people. If you look at their strength went up and up. It went down during the concentrated loading, and then it super compensated for weeks 11 and 12 in the restitution cycle. This is actually kind of what it might look like. So this is a sort of a flat loading, concentrated loading cycle. Basically, you know how you would normally step up maybe from moderate to moderately high to very high volume, and then you step off. Flat loading, you essentially do very high volume for, say, 3 weeks straight, and then you follow that up by a restitution cycle. That's only for advanced athletes, right? And again, that's probably more of a concentrated loading type of protocol. Okay, this can be used in a step-like fashion, but this is, again, very advanced. So you flat load for 3 weeks, have a restitution cycle, raise that flat loading stimulus, restitution cycle, raise it again, and then have a much longer restitution cycle of like 2 weeks. This is very advanced. It would occur likely in the summer for a college athlete when psychological stress is low and they don't have classes. You can also combine training blocks. So as you have block 1 is preparatory, we step up, 1, 2, 3, step down. Then we do sort of a concentrated loading cycle, step down, and then we do sort of more of a taper cycle where we have high intensity restitution, high intensity, 2 restitutions, and then we're ready for the competition. So, there's a way you have moderate fatigue and preparatory, high fatigue and specific, low fatigue right before the competition. One thing I want to point out is when other things we can manipulate are things like volume, which is the total amount of work done in a workout. This can be increased by increasing frequency, amount of sets, as well as training per session. You can increase it by increasing the sets, the repetitions, and the duration of training. Notice what I'm saying here, that the greater the years of training, in general, the greater the training volume. So you may be able to make gains with 3 to 4 sets when you're untrained, or even 1 set. When you're highly trained, you might need 8 to 16 sets, right? It just depends. So with all these models, it's clear that program variation is a complex topic. Okay, periodization itself is program rest and program variation in order to reach a physiological fitness peak. That's based on models such as fitness fatigue model, which suggests that there is an increase or 2 intervening variables, including fitness and fatigue. The difference between the 2 is fitness. So we have to alternate between training and restitution cycles to realize that fitness outcome. We also have the Hans-Selye model, which suggests that there's an alarm reaction, a stage of resistance, and a stage of exhaustion. Ideally, we are fluctuating between the first 2 stages. The reason why we hit stage 3 is because the stimulus no longer knocks us into alarm reaction, causing us to need variation. However, it could also mean that we have a too high of a stimulus too frequently, and therefore we overreach. We are exhausted, and therefore we need to program in rest. The next lecture will discuss periodization models. Thank you for your time.